is in a case when there are network externalities, such as the introduction of fax machines. Fax machines weren't worth anything, right, until lots of people had fax machines. If you had just said, well, once we get up to half the population having fax machines, the marginal externality of having an additional fax is probably not that high, right? Because if you don't have the fax, then you can go to your neighbor and get the fax there. So you getting the fax doesn't have that big of an externality on me, right? But the problem is if we set the subsidy at that level, we would never get to the equilibrium where everyone has fax machines. Because initially, there's like no value to having the fax machine. And no one's going to adopt it. So to get up to the efficient equilibrium, we might have to give a really big subsidy early on. And then only later adjust downwards to the amount that we want, right? And this is the reason why lots of internet companies lose money early on and then make it later. Is because they have a network good, and they're trying to subsidize to get up to a critical mass where they can then cash in on things, right? This principle is called the insulating tariff. OK, so the most common practical application of Pigouvian taxation is for pollution. So one example of this is what's called effluent taxation. So most cars are required to have various things to reduce the smog that they emit. But this guy, Lawrence White, proposed an alternative, which is that cars would have to have regular smog checks, and depending on how much smog they were letting out, they would pay a tax. That would mean that people who, let's say, lived in really not densely populated areas might have dirtier cars, because we're really, a little bit of pollution is not really that bad. The problem is when you get into dense areas and lots of people are affected by it. So in a not so dense area, they could have a low effluent tax. In a denser area, they could have a higher effluent tax. And that would be more efficient than just mandating that everyone gets the same clean stuff put onto their cars, right? Now, the French government does a very extensive system of pollution tax, not for cars, but for factories. So basically, they have sensors on the top of every smokestack in a factory that senses all the particles that are coming out. And for each one of the particles that comes out, you have to pay a tax. Another example of this is the goal of a carbon tax. So we're going to talk much more about this on Thursday. But in Europe, there is something like a carbon tax to try to deal with global warming. Now, economists usually prefer this sort of taxation over direct regulation. And why would that be the case? Is George here?
Yes.
Yeah, George.
Over direct regulation.
Yeah, so like, why don't they just want us, why do economists usually oppose having the government go and say, look, this company needs to reduce its pollution by this much, this company needs to reduce its pollution by this much. Instead, they favor just putting a uniform tax on.
Well, it would be more efficient than going to each company and saying, well, you're producing this much. Well, we have to tax, or we have to take this much money from you.
Yeah.
It would be more efficient to just overall say, we're going to tax everyone based on how much you produce.
So why is that a more efficient solution?
Just intuitively speaking, I would say that it would prevent people from having to analyze each and every company individually as you go along. Whereas an overall tax, you can just set it as that, and then you wouldn't really have to worry about it.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track. Jacob, do you want to?
It's kind of relevant to, I forget what it was, talking about the quotas that could be traded in California, where it may be more expensive for some people, for some firms, to reduce their the amount they produce.
Yeah.
So saying to every firm you have to reduce by this much may be really bad for one firm, and it would have been better to have this other firm that it didn't cost as much to produce.
Yeah.
Produce more.
That's absolutely right. So if the effects were really localized, if the harms that were coming out of a particular factory were just based on how much that factory was letting out, and they didn't they weren't sort of interchangeable with the harms that were going on somewhere else, so that if that factory produced more, it could get really, really bad, and if that factory produced less, the marginal harm would go down. Then you would have to look at each factory individually. But if it's sort of like the overall effect is the only thing that matters, then it's much more efficient to let firms say, oh, well, you need to pollute more you can pollute more, but I'll pollute less to offset that, right? And a tax lets people do that, right? It lets the people who are most efficient reduce by the most, and the people who are less efficient reduce by less. Okay, so one example of that was studied by Meredith Fowley and her co-authors, and she looked at the market for nitrous oxide reductions. And the way that nitrous oxide reduction works in regulation works in the US is that there's a tradable permit system like Jacob was describing, but it can't be traded from car owners to factories. It's only among different factories. And what that ends up meaning is that it turns out cars put out a lot of nitrous oxide. And it would be really quite cheap, actually, to reduce nitrous oxide pollution by putting stuff on cars. But because cars can't sell their right to pollute nitrous oxide to the factories, you end up having a costly reduction in factory pollution, and the cars don't pay anything for what they're doing. So I don't know why I don't have the graph from Fowley's paper. But anyways, they had a very nice graph where they looked at sort of like what were the cheapest ways to reduce in factories and how cheap was it in cars. And they calculated that you could save about $2 billion if you allowed the cars to sell their rights to nitrous oxide to the factories and get nitrous oxide emission reducing features put on the cars in order to do that. Yeah, okay.
Wait, so how, for like an individual car, how would you like figure out how much like nitrous oxide like you're reducing?
Well, it turns out you can just put on a little filter on the car basically that like eliminates all the nitrous oxide pollution.
So, like,
so you could give, so like every time someone did that,
yeah,
you could project what is like the average amount that that car would be driving, and you could give them that amount of credits.
all right.
Or they could get a credit every time they buy gas, for example.
Okay.
Okay. So a Pigouvian tax, like we showed here, would just raise the supply curve up by the amount that incorporates the externality and reduce the optimum to the right level. Okay. Now, in the US, most Pigouvian taxes are collected actually through the legal system. So when a firm or an individual causes harm, they usually get sued. And the court is in charge of assessing how much harm was caused. And the individual causing the harm has to pay what are called compensatory damages, which directly redress the harm that was caused. But they also sometimes have to pay what are called punitive damages. And these deal with a few things. So punitive damages deal, first of all, with the fact that not everyone who does something that causes harm gets caught. And so if you're only going to get caught with 1/10 probability to get people on average to internalize the effects of what they do, they should have to pay 9 times that amount in punitive damages for every amount of compensatory damage, right? Another reason for doing this is that sometimes people can take actions that put themselves in the way of the harm of an externality. So for example, imagine that I can wear a face mask that basically gets rid of all the harms of pollution caused by a factory. But now if I sue the factory, I can get fully compensated for all the harms they do me. Then I'm never going to buy that face mask to protect me from the pollution, which obviously would be the efficient thing for me to do. So sometimes you don't want all the damages being paid directly to the person who's harmed, because that reduces their incentive to avoid the harm. Okay. More on this will not be on the problem set. It was on a past problem set, sorry. So you often hear people on the right end of the political spectrum complaining about all the lawsuits in the United States, it's so litigious and so forth. But one reason why it is so litigious in the United States is because we're so committed to the market system. We believe in incorporating payments in accordance with product. The Europeans, on the other hand, believe much more in direct regulation. And because they have much more direct regulation, they have many fewer lawsuits. And a lot of people on the right say, oh, why can't we be like Europe? But it's precisely because we have such a free market system that we are like this, because we incorporate things using market mechanisms where people have to pay for the consequences of their action rather than directly controlling their behavior. Okay. Now, instead of having a, instead of having a tax, another alternative is what's called cap and trade. And this means you put a cap on the total amount of the activity that takes place, but then you allow people to trade the rights to do it. So a simple way to implement this is to just put a maximum on the total amount of pollution and then auction off permits that allow people to pollute. But the total number of permits is fixed, right? So let's return to the simple smoking example. Imagine, Pagoo would put a tax on at 90 cents per cigarette, not $9 per cigarette, sorry. An alternative to putting a tax on at $9 per cigarette would be to cap the total number of cigarettes sold at 55,000, right? Because we know that everyone's going to be consuming 5.5 cigarettes, right, in our previous example. So if you put a total cap on 55,000, then the supply would be perfectly inelastic at 55,000, right? Now the demand for cigarettes, right, just derived from what we got before, was 5 times 3 minus, sorry, 2 minus the price, right? Oh no, 3 minus the price, because $1 was the private cost, right? And so this is the total demand for cigarettes. The question is, if 55,000 was the maximum supply in the market, what would have to be the equilibrium price for the market to clear? Charlie. So if this is the demand and the total supply is capped is 55,000, what's going to have to be the market clearing price in order for there to be an equilibrium?
You just set the equation. So
Yeah.
150 minus 55,000 is 95,000.
Yeah.
And then divide by 55,000. So 95 over 5.
Which is 1.9, which is exactly the equilibrium price we had before, right? Because there was $1 of private cost plus the 90 cents. So the effect of putting on this cap at the optimal amount is exactly the same as the effect of having the tax, right? Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
So it seems like in all of these kind of, we're using taxes to influence the supply and demand curves.
Yeah.
But there's also money that's kind of like leaving the system almost.
From the tax, like to the government, yeah.
Right. So why don't we consider like using that tax as part of the utility to balance out the people who are harmed in an externality?
So we could do that, and sometimes people do. In fact, that's exactly what the legal system does, right? But the one problem is that people might have an incentive to make themselves be harmed by the externality in order to collect that tax.
Okay, but
And that's the main reason why we don't do that. But yes, that's the basic principle behind the legal system, is you do compensate the people who are harmed.
so
But you have to compensate them in a way where they can't manipulate that too much. You know what I mean?
So why is it efficient? It just seems like $9 or 90 cents per cigarette is kind of just exiting the system because we're not really considering what the government uses the tax money on.
Yeah.
So, like, that to me just seems like it's kind of like draining money out of.
Well, that's a great point, Kevin, and we'll talk about that. Well, we won't talk about that much, but it's very related to something called the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, which is a mechanism we'll talk about next time. And a big problem with that thing is it does use these externalities, and therefore things drain out of the system. That's a big issue. But often you can pay back some of that to some extent to the people who are being harmed, and if not to the people who are being harmed, more broadly to the population as a whole, without giving them an incentive systematically to lie about the. Yeah, Matt.
But isn't it also just like used as a price incentive so that like the people, everyone else is happier because less cigarettes are being smoked?
Yeah.
So they're better off by that. So like they don't need that.
Yeah, but the people who are smoking are worse off, right? And so you could sort of compensate them, you know.